The breath caught violently in my throat, the absolute second his hands, large, intensely warm, and uncharacteristically hesitant, found the bare, flushed skin of my shoulders. He was searching blindly for the heavy, invisible knots I had carried like a silent curse for an entire lifetime. For most of my waking life, my own hands had been the ones doing the heavy lifting and the miraculous healing. They didn't swing hammers to build drywall or hold brushes to paint beautiful canvases, but they quietly, desperately erased the agonizing pain of others. My name is Chloe, and for well over a grueling decade, I've been a licensed massage therapist. I wasn't just some weekend hobbyist who picked up cheap parlor tricks from late-night internet videos. I was a dedicated professional who had obsessively studied, trained, and practiced until my fingertips could literally read human suffering the exact same way a seasoned symphony musician effortlessly reads complex sheet music. I had spent endless, exhausting days working on the battered, bruised bodies of pro athletes, completely worn out nurses and miserable office workers whose spines were essentially broken by cheap desk chairs and the crushing, invisible weight of their monotonous daily lives. I knew the complex machinery of the human body intimately, inherently understanding not just the rigid mechanics of bones and torn muscles, but the profound, crushing gravity of the psychological burdens people dragged into my home studio, a weight that had absolutely nothing to do with gravity. Yet, the cruelest irony was that the very career that defined my life's true calling had also been the silent, creeping poison that brought about the quiet, agonizing end of my marriage. My ex-husband Liam never truly grasped the intimate, vulnerable nature of what I did for a living. In the early optimistic days of our relationship, he desperately tried to play the part of the fiercely supportive partner, proudly bragging to his buddies over beers about my thriving business, and even rolling up his sleeves to help me paint the pale walls of the quiet studio where I spent my long days. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a dark, insidious rot took root deep within him. It might have been pure, unadulterated jealousy, deep-seated, masculine insecurity, or perhaps just the archaic, suffocating idea deeply ingrained in him that a woman's physical touch should completely and exclusively belong to her immediate family and absolutely no one else in the world. Liam certainly wasn't the explosive type to scream or dramatically shatter plates against the wall. He never once raised his voice in anger about it because that simply wasn't who Liam was. Instead, his deep resentment bled out slowly in dry, venomous smiles and incredibly passive, aggressive jokes about my long days, or his snide remarks whenever I had all-male clients again on my daily schedule. We dragged that heavy anchor for 10 long years before the suffocating quiet finally won out. The marriage ultimately flatlined and ended the exact same way it had painfully lived, without any violently slammed doors or dramatic, fiery, tear-soaked affairs. It was simply marked by a hollow, deafening silence sitting between us at the dinner table, until we both finally looked at each other and accepted the brutal reality that we had absolutely nothing left to say. When he finally packed up his things and officially moved out, our son Harrison stayed behind with me. By that turbulent time, Harrison was 21 years old, a towering college junior actively navigating the utterly brutal, cutthroat world of semi-pro football on a highly coveted sports scholarship. Depending entirely on the athletic season and his chaotic schedule, he found himself endlessly bouncing back and forth between his loud, bustling campus life and the quiet, controlled sanctuary of my suburban home. Physically, he was built exactly like his father, tall, incredibly broad, and physically imposing. But internally, he possessed my quiet, intensely observant nature. There was an incredibly grounded, immovable energy radiating from him. A fierce, unwavering physical discipline that I secretly admired far more than I ever dared to let on. Having grown up his entire life silently watching me work on broken bodies, he possessed a deep, inherent fascination with the intricate dance of human anatomy, physical healing, and bodily recovery. I would frequently find his massive frame lingering just outside the threshold of my studio door, silently, intensely watching exactly how I moved my hands, while he listened to the soft, rhythmic ambient music I faithfully played during my long sessions. I used to joke with my girlfriends over wine that Harrison had unfortunately inherited his dense, unbreakable bones from his absent dad, but he got his massive, bleeding heart entirely from me. We effortlessly shared a beautiful, incredibly comfortable rhythm together, a life filled with comforting late-night dinners where we'd intensely talk through the crushing, suffocating pressure of his high-stakes game days and the agonizing reality of his perpetually sore, torn muscles. We were undeniably close, perhaps much closer than the average modern mother and son, but absolutely never in a way that felt strange, crossing a line, or remotely inappropriate. We had simply survived a massive amount of emotional wreckage side by side, and he held a profound, genuine respect for my specialized work, occasionally pulling me aside to humbly ask me to teach him how to properly stretch or how to desperately release built-up tension after a particularly brutal afternoon of athletic training. But absolutely everything fundamentally shifted off its axis on a crisp, freezing night last fall, while the aggressive wind hummed a low, haunting, rattling melody against the fragile kitchen windows. Harrison trudged in incredibly late from a grueling, punishing football practice, his massive shoulders slumped entirely forward in defeat, and his normally stoic expression drawn unbearably tight with physical agony. Watching him painfully and slowly roll his thick neck, I plainly told him he looked incredibly stiff, to which he let out a guttural groan, bitterly complaining that his ruthless coach had forced the team to run brutal back-breaking overload drills for hours. He muttered darkly that he felt as though someone had maliciously parked a heavy commercial truck directly onto his spine. Without taking a single second to logically think it through, acting purely on deep maternal instinct intertwined with years of ingrained professional habit, I pushed my chair back, stood up, and moved directly behind his broad frame at the kitchen table. My highly trained, sensitive hands pressed gently but firmly into his thick traps, immediately launching a search for the jagged, angry knots of muscle that I intuitively knew were hiding right beneath the surface. I worked completely methodically, flawlessly syncing my own deep breathing with the natural rhythm of my physical movements, executing the precise techniques exactly the way I always had done for 1,000 different strangers. He let out a low sigh and muttered that I was still the best, which completely should have been nothing more than a casual throwaway compliment from a grateful son. But the incredibly soft, almost breathless, and dangerously certain way the simple words left his lips caught something deep, hidden and incredibly fragile inside my chest. Something I completely wasn't expecting to ever feel again. I managed a small, remarkably quiet smile, and softly replied that it was simply what I do for a living. But then, the heavy air in the kitchen grew incredibly thick, and a profound, suffocating silence abruptly settled over the space between us, as my hands continued to work the tension from his skin. It absolutely wasn't tense, nor was it painfully awkward. It was just an absolute stillness that made it feel as though the entire room itself was holding its collective breath in pure anticipation. He didn't dare pull away from my touch, and terrified of breaking the spell. Neither did I. That single fleeting night permanently anchored itself in my racing mind, not because of absolutely anything that actually happened, but because of the palpable electric weight of everything that didn't. Something huge had fundamentally changed between us, barely perceptible at first, acting exactly like the hidden temperature in a closed room, slowly rising just one tiny degree at a time, until you are suddenly engulfed in an inescapable warmth, but cannot logically pinpoint exactly when the dangerous fire actually started. The very next morning, my mind still heavily clouded with a bizarre, lingering tension, I stumbled into the bright kitchen, only to find him standing squarely at the hot stove, completely shirtless, effortlessly flipping a golden pancake in the pan. He flashed an incredibly easy, devastating grin over his broad shoulder and wished me a good morning, and instead of moving immediately to pour my essential cup of dark coffee, I found myself inexplicably standing right there for a fraction of a second, entirely too long, just silently watching him. His wide back was a breathtaking landscape of sculpted, undeniable strength, fiercely forged by literal years of relentless, agonizing athletic discipline. As a professional woman whose entire livelihood and identity revolved around reading human bodies and deeply understanding exactly how they carried pure exhaustion and heavy tension, I physically couldn't help but hyper-fixate on every single, glorious detail of his frame. A strange, completely alien flutter erupted violently in the center of my chest, which I immediately frantically tried to brush away by quickly muttering a lame excuse about absolutely not needing him to cook breakfast for me. He laughed the awkwardness off seamlessly, smoothly joking that serving up breakfast was the absolute least he could do for me after my heroic late night shoulder rescue the evening prior. But suddenly, the visceral memory of my bare hands pressing deeply into his hot skin absolutely no longer felt clinical, detached, or safely maternal in my mind. It felt overwhelmingly, dangerously warm. The memory lingered like a ghost in the house. Later that exact same afternoon, he casually peeked his handsome head directly into my home studio, leaning his heavy frame against the wooden doorframe with a casual, yet intensely thoughtful expression painted across his features. He confidently asked, "Hey Mom, got time for one more client?" I immediately raised a highly skeptical eyebrow, teasingly asking him if a chronically broke college kid could even remotely afford to pay my expensive hourly rate. He shot back with a devastatingly charming grin, smoothly asking if he'd automatically get the elusive VIP treatment if he just said yes. I let out a genuine laugh, telling him that he absolutely always does get the VIP treatment, and just like that, the invisible fragile line shifted once again as he boldly stepped directly into the pale, serene light of the quiet room, and I nervously began prepping the massage table. I hurriedly laid down fresh, stark linens, poured the warm, fragrant oil, and let the pale light wash over us. He climbed up and lay face down on the table, and I instantly fell back into the comforting, highly familiar rhythm of my life's work, my warm hands effortlessly gliding over the well-known muscular terrain of his broad back, wide shoulders, and rigid spine. Deep beneath my pressing palms, I could physically feel exactly where the brutal athletic strain actively lived, closely listening as his battered body told me the painful, exhausting stories his stoic, prideful mouth absolutely never would. But right in the absolute quiet middle of the entire session, he shattered the tranquil silence with a single sentence that pulled me into a state of absolute paralyzing stillness. He asked, his deep voice vibrating low and incredibly steady in the room, "Do you ever get tired of always being the strong one?" I froze completely, the blood rushing in my ears as my slick hands hovered rigidly mid-motion just above his skin. After a pregnant pause, I quietly, defeatedly admitted to him that sometimes, yes, I really did. A long, incredibly heavy silence stretched out lazily, completely wrapping around the two of us, until he spoke once again, his voice even softer and far more intimate than before. He told me with absolute certainty that I didn't have to be strong. Not when I was with him. That was the exact, undeniable moment the tectonic plates of our shared reality violently shifted once more. The seismic shift absolutely didn't happen in the fragrant, heavy air of the studio, nor did it happen in the physical room itself. It happened deeply, profoundly, and permanently inside of me. His heavy words absolutely didn't demand anything from me, nor did they maliciously ask for a single thing. They simply offered. He was freely offering me a profound level of pure, unadulterated care that I hadn't even consciously realized I had been completely starving to death for. On the mundane surface, the days that immediately followed seemed ordinary and completely Harrison continued to bounce endlessly and exhaustingly between his grueling football training sessions and his demanding university classes. We still peacefully shared our comforting, late-night meals together, still laughed loudly over the television shows we both mutually enjoyed, and still talked openly about life, football, and the chronic, burning tightness living in his hamstrings. But the dangerous undercurrent dragging beneath us had changed entirely. It wasn't obvious in the physical way we acted around each other, but entirely in the hyper-aware, highly sensitive way we now noticed absolutely everything about one another. A few days later, I absent-mindedly walked into the kitchen and caught him standing directly at the counter, methodically drying a ceramic coffee mug with a towel. He had the sleeves of his casual shirt pushed aggressively up, putting the quiet, devastating physical power of his thick arms on full, unapologetic display. It was far from the first time I had ever seen him looking exactly like that, but this specific time my wandering eyes lingered just a fraction of a second too long. Drinking in the sight, catching my heavy gaze, he calmly looked over and smiled in that effortlessly easy, magnetic way he naturally possessed. "You good?" he asked simply. I nodded my head quickly, nervously blaming my lingering stare on just being overly tired that day. Without missing a single beat, he stepped forward and asked if I wanted him to generously return the favor, specifically massage. Wise. I let out a sharp laugh, playfully teasing him that he had only been officially practicing for a single week, and was already aggressively trying to completely take over my entire business. He simply shrugged his massive shoulders, his dark eyes locking intensely onto mine, and completely seriously told me that I had been carrying a massive amount of weight for a very long time, and that someone really ought to finally take care of me for once in my life. There was not a single trace of his usual biting sarcasm in his tone. It was just incredibly steady, raw, real, and radiating with a profound warmth that left me totally breathless. I didn't dare give him an answer right then and there, but later that exact same afternoon, while I was quietly and methodically folding clean towels in the dim atmospheric light of the studio, I suddenly heard his heavy footsteps pause right behind me. "Lesson 2, he announced smoothly. I spun around rapidly to find him standing squarely in the open doorway, wearing that exact same thoughtful, intense look on his handsome face. He absolutely wasn't being pushy, nor was he carrying any heavy, unspoken expectations. He was just intensely, magnetically present. I gave a slow, defeated nod of agreement to Lesson 2. And he boldly stepped inside the room, gently pushing the heavy wooden door completely closed behind him. Taking a seat on the very edge of the padded massage table, I motioned with a trembling hand for him to step much closer into my personal space. I verbally guided him through the absolute basics, showing him exactly how to properly warm the essential oil through friction between his palms, how to physically flow with the natural rising rhythm of a human breath, rather than using sheer brute force, and exactly how pure focused intention always mattered infinitely more than raw physical strength ever could. Then I slowly turned my back to him, and he finally placed his large, incredibly powerful hands directly upon my aching shoulders. They were undeniably strong, yet surprisingly incredibly tentative, almost as if he were far more terrified of accidentally hurting me by doing way too much than he was of doing far too little. He asked incredibly softly if he was pressing in the right spot, and I nodded silently as his warm hands began to move with startling, profound care, quickly and intuitively, learning the intricate tension points he had physically felt buried deep in his own athletic body so many times before. As his strong thumbs dug purposely and deeply into the agonizing knots lined up perfectly along my upper back, I took a slow, incredibly steady inhale of air. And then, for the absolute first time in what genuinely felt like decades of sheer survival, I genuinely let go. I didn't completely unravel right there on the table, but it was just enough to finally feel my rigid, locked muscles physically soften and to consciously stop subconsciously holding my breath. He didn't use many words at all, but the undeniable heavy pressure of his touch spoke volumes directly to my soul. It silently communicated, "I see you. I completely respect you. I am firmly here." His searching hands miraculously managed to find the exact crushing weight I had been hauling around, discovering the invisible, intensely battered places where my shoulders had grown permanently stiff and agonizingly rigid from decades of being the unbreakable pillar of strength for absolutely everyone else in my life. I murmured into the quiet, heavy room that he was remarkably good at doing this. He paused his rhythmic movements for a fraction of a second, his deep voice dropping to a quiet, intimate whisper, boldly admitting that he just desperately wanted me to finally feel the incredible safety and unwavering support I had always provided for him his entire life. And sitting there beneath his warm touch, I truly, deeply did. When the improvised massage eventually drew to a reluctant close, I remained entirely still for a long, heavy moment. His massive hands drifted away from my flushed skin so gently, heavily reminiscent of the final, soft waves of a receding ocean tide pulling back from the shore. I slowly turned my body around and looked directly up into his face, immediately noticing something profound violently shifting deep within his dark eyes. I saw absolutely no panicked confusion, and not a single, microscopic ounce of hesitation. I saw only deep, raw, brutally honest care. And in that breathless, earth-shattering fraction of a second, the illusion finally completely shattered. I wasn't looking at my little boy anymore. I was looking squarely at Harrison, the full-grown man. I was looking at the incredibly steady, remarkably kind, and highly intuitive man I had sacrificed everything to help raise. Simultaneously, he was looking right back and seeing me not just as the archaic concept of a mother, but strictly as Chloe, as a living, breathing, desperately lonely woman. Moving with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, he reached out and wrapped his massive, muscular arms entirely around my trembling frame in a quiet, profoundly grounding hug. There was zero frantic rush, and absolutely no suffocating awkwardness between us. Just an enveloping, radiating warmth that silently commanded me that he finally had me, and I just needed to breathe. As I completely surrendered to the tight embrace, a massive, terrifying realization washed entirely over my mind. Whatever this intense, terrifying closeness between us was slowly morphing into, it absolutely wasn't something I needed to desperately sprint away from in sheer terror. Because it was fiercely, undeniably real. It was completely something I had to stay and try to deeply understand. The agonizingly beautiful days that immediately followed felt incredibly however, it absolutely wasn't the chilling kind of quiet that stems from emotional distance or painful awkwardness. It was a massively fuller, richer quiet. Now it genuinely felt as though a heavy, unspoken truth had finally settled perfectly between us, completely understood without a single messy word ever needing to be spoken aloud. Neither Harrison nor I dared to bring up the intense massage, but the highly charged air in the house constantly carried the memory of it, lingering as soft as human breath, but remaining as undeniably real and heavy as gravity itself. One evening, while I was mindlessly tidying up the clutter in the living room long after dinner had ended, his deep voice suddenly floated softly toward me from the dark doorway of my studio. He casually asked, leaning against the frame, if I had a quick second to spare. I turned around quickly, a half-laugh escaping my lips, and playfully teased him about how much he seemed to suddenly really enjoy constantly hanging around my workspace. Shrugging his incredibly wide shoulders dismissively, he openly admitted that the room just inherently felt incredibly calm to him. He stepped inside with a slow, highly measured pace, intentionally not crossing the entire room just yet. He confessed that he had been seriously thinking and wondered if maybe I could actually keep teaching him, not just as a passing fun joke, but to really truly teach him the actual mechanics of the craft. Tilting my head to the side in genuine curiosity, I asked if the massive star athlete was seriously considering completely switching his college major to massage therapy. A sheepish, devastatingly handsome smile briefly crossed his lips as he quickly clarified that it wasn't exactly that. He reminded me of my own deeply held philosophy, that human touch possesses the profound magical power to physically heal, and admitted that he just desperately wanted to understand it significantly better. He wanted to know what that kind of deep physical connection genuinely meant on a soul level. I stood entirely frozen, silently watching him for a long, drawn-out moment. This exact same tall, intensely grounded young man who, years ago, used to entirely collapse and fall deeply asleep right in my lap after grueling childhood soccer practices. Now he stood squarely before me in the dim light, fully possessing hands that carried an incredible, intoxicating mixture of purposeful strength and startling gentleness. He was looking at me with dark eyes that violently suggested I was absolutely still the absolute center of his entire universe, even if neither of us possessed the exact vocabulary to explain what the hell that actually meant anymore. Yielding completely to the inevitable pull, I quietly agreed, softly telling him that our next real lesson would start right now with learning. As I physically demonstrated the techniques, he listened with a fierce, unwavering, and almost frightening intensity. I meticulously explained exactly how to properly center one's breath, how to train the mind to notice far more than just raw muscle tissue, and how to actually physically feel the exact places where human beings hoard their hidden sadness, their explosive tension, and all the dark, ugly things they never dare to speak aloud. To put the heavy theory into practice, I sat down heavily on the very edge of the massage table, deliberately turning my back entirely toward him. I could actually feel the intense radiating heat of his large hands as they hovered just a fraction of an inch above my skin, before finally making solid, warm contact. All the previous nervous hesitation was completely gone now, entirely replaced by a deep, resonant care and a natural swelling rhythm that beautifully and flawlessly balanced deep physical pressure with agonizingly perfect pauses. I whispered softly into the quiet shadows that he was aggressively picking up the intricate techniques incredibly fast. He deliberately let my compliment hang suspended in the air, actively choosing not to answer right away, purposefully allowing me to fully feel the heavy, deliberate intention driving every single sweeping motion of his hands. His strong thumbs gently but firmly kneaded deep into the tight tops of my shoulders, methodically breaking down and easing away the literal years of accumulated toxic stress that I had deeply buried within my own flesh. Keeping my voice extremely low and intimate, I asked him if he knew that back when he was just 3 years old, he used to climb right up into my lap, press his tiny, soft little hands against my exhausted face, and accurately tell me, "You are tired, Mama." almost as if he possessed a supernatural ability to completely see my exhaustion long before I even realized it myself. An incredibly soft, rumbling chuckle vibrated deep from his wide chest, as he admitted he absolutely didn't remember doing that. I whispered back that I did. Instantly, his moving hands completely paused their soothing rhythm, flattening out entirely and resting heavily right between my shoulder blades to physically and emotionally ground me to the earth. His voice was a low, rough murmur when he theorized that perhaps he had inherently always known exactly how to properly care for me, but simply lacked the knowledge of how to physically show it to me until this exact perfect moment. Those heavy, loaded words hung entirely suspended in the fragrant air of the studio, like something utterly and terrifyingly sacred. I absolutely didn't dare to speak a single syllable, actively choosing instead to let the profound, heavy silence stretch out indefinitely between us. It absolutely wasn't an uncomfortable quiet. It was a deeply, profoundly healing void, where absolutely nothing in the entire world needed to be urgently fixed. It merely needed to be securely held. As he eventually resumed his rhythmic, sweeping motions, I found myself sinking and relaxing even deeper into his hypnotic touch than before. His warm hand slid incredibly slowly down my arms in a completely unhurried manner, expertly and flawlessly tracing the long, elegant arcs of muscular tension and divine release. There was a remarkably soothing, almost intoxicating quality to the exact way his skin dragged against mine. It absolutely wasn't just technically proficient or highly practiced. It was profoundly human and dangerously personal. Eventually, his long, strong fingers deliberately slowed their mesmerizing pace right at the highly sensitive base of my neck, applying a gentle, aching pressure before coming to a complete, absolute dead stop, compelled by an entirely invisible force. I turned my head just slightly, allowing my searching eyes to lock directly and fiercely with his over the curve of my own bare shoulder. Neither one of us dared to breathe a single terrified word. Yet an overwhelming, massive surge of electricity passed rapidly and violently between us. Perhaps it was a deeply shared ancestral memory, or perhaps it was just a brutal, undeniable truth, finally coming to light. It was a startling mutual recognition that we were both currently standing right on the razor, thin edge of something colossal, something neither of us possessed the sheer courage to officially name, but that we both undeniably, physically felt burning in our veins. And terrifyingly enough, it absolutely didn't feel morally wrong in the slightest. It just felt brutally, undeniably real. That entire night, sleep completely and utterly evaded me. I lay totally paralyzed in my dark, empty bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling while the soft, rhythmic hum of the dishwasher echoed in the distant, empty kitchen. My frantically racing mind aggressively and obsessively replayed the intense, burning look I had witnessed in Harrison's eyes, a gaze that was incredibly steady, completely unguarded, totally quiet, yet overflowing with an astonishing, terrifying fullness. It absolutely wasn't raw, animalistic desire, nor was it childish, naive confusion. It was purely concentrated, violently undiluted attention. Of course, I had been seen by people before in my life, by a decade of paying clients, by professional colleagues, and even by Liam during the wildly optimistic, early years of our doomed marriage. But this specific gaze felt violently, fundamentally different. This felt exactly like being completely exposed and fiercely seen by someone who intimately knew every single fractured, ugly version of me. The desperately tired, the fiercely strong, the utterly broken, and the foolishly brave. And despite clearly seeing all of that emotional wreckage, he absolutely didn't even flinch. The following morning broke unapologetically cold and violently gray. I was right in the middle of meticulously wiping down the faux leather of the massage table, prepping the quiet room for a regular paying client, when Harrison casually strolled right past the open studio door. He was entirely shirtless once again, fresh off a brutal, agonizing morning run, with a stark white towel slung casually over his broad shoulder, and his thick, dark hair still heavily damp with sweat. He didn't even bother to stop walking. Instead, he just flashed me a highly knowing, devastatingly handsome smile as he passed right by. The exact kind of confident, deeply intimate smile you only give to someone when you already know exactly what dark, twisted thoughts are frantically running through their mind. I was left standing there entirely frozen for a long, agonizing moment, my shaking hands still gripping the edges of the massage table tightly, suddenly entirely unsure whether I was the one currently being fiercely studied, or if I had actually been the helpless subject of his intense observation all along. Later that exact same week, the thick tension ratcheted up even further when he smoothly and casually asked if I needed any extra help managing the busy studio. I instinctively, almost fiercely rejected the offer, almost forced the harsh words out of my throat to tell him that I was perfectly fine handling it alone. But there was something incredibly potent in the casual, yet quietly, intensely hopeful way he posed the specific question that completely bypassed all my mental defenses and simply made me nod in dumb agreement. I took the necessary time to meticulously show him exactly how to arrange the delicate linens perfectly, the precise, exact method for folding the large towels the right way, and the strategic placement of the essential oils so they were absolutely always within an easy arm's reach during a session. He absorbed the mundane information with his trademark, unwavering full attention. At one incredibly charged point during the lesson, he reached out to hand me a small glass bottle of lavender oil, and our bare fingers accidentally electrically brushed against each other. That fleeting, accidental physical contact absolutely should have meant nothing at all. But when I quickly snapped my gaze upward, my heart hammering in my chest, I realized he was absolutely already staring intensely right at me. There was absolutely zero inappropriate sleaziness in his dark gaze, and not even a single microscopic hint of awkward discomfort. There was only a vast, consuming warmth, tightly paired with something infinitely deeper and far more dangerous. He was the very first one to finally clear his throat and violently break the magnetic spell, quietly noting that I was incredibly good at creating an atmosphere of total peace. I forced a shaky, highly unconvincing smile to my trembling lips and weakly replied that I had simply had a lot of practice at it over the years. He hesitated for a painful, agonizing second before his deep voice dropped to an even quieter, violently more intimate register. "Do you ever miss being cared for?" he asked softly, the words hitting me like a physical blow. That devastating question hung suspended in the claustrophobic space between our bodies, thick and suffocating like heavy gray smoke. I physically couldn't form the necessary words to answer him right then and there. But later that exact same evening, long after the dinner plates had been cleared away, I found myself inexplicably, magnetically drawn to lingering in the dark, silent hallway right outside his bedroom door. I didn't even attempt to knock on the wood. I merely stood rooted to the floorboards for a breathless, terrifying moment, resting my trembling hand gently against the cool wooden door frame, intensely dwelling on just how agonizingly long it had actually been since any human being had touched my tired body purely to communicate the message. "I see you." Right as I finally gathered the pathetic courage to turn around and flee, the heavy door swung aggressively open, causing us both to freeze completely in our tracks in the dim light. Breaking the immense tension, he flashed a gentle, completely open smile and smoothly confessed that he had actually just been on his way out. To come find me, I didn't utter a single terrified sound in response. I simply turned silently on my heel and allowed him to quietly follow me back down the long hall and directly into the secluded sanctuary of the studio. There were absolutely no educational lessons on the agenda this time, and neither of us bothered making any more light-hearted defensive jokes about him being my eager student. The only sounds entirely filling the highly charged room were the incredibly soft rustle of fresh, clean linens, the low pulsing thrum of the background music, and the deafening, quiet understanding that we were both actively choosing to step across a massive boundary into a completely new, dangerously uncharted kind of silence. I climbed up and sat heavily on the padded table, and for the absolute first time, he didn't wait to ask for my professional guidance. He confidently positioned his massive frame directly behind my back, letting his large hands rest incredibly lightly against the tense skin of my shoulders, patiently waiting until I finally let out a long, shuddering, defeated exhale. And then the true profound healing began. His firm touch had vastly evolved. It was undeniably steady and dangerously confident now, holding absolutely nothing back, except pure, concentrated care. My starved, touch-deprived body immediately responded. Before my rational mind could even process the inherent danger, eagerly easing entirely into the rhythmic, hypnotic sway of his fluid movements, completely softening under the calculated pressure of a man who instinctively knew exactly where my hidden pain stubbornly resided and precisely how to expertly coax it out of hiding. He leaned his head in close, his breath hot against my skin, as he murmured softly that I felt like I was physically carrying significantly more weight today. I nodded weakly, whispering my pathetic confession that I absolutely always carry this much weight, but most oblivious people simply never bother to notice it. I do, he replied with devastating, absolute conviction. And God, he truly, deeply did. That particular session stretched on infinitely longer than usual. Absolutely not. Because we had explicitly planned out a longer time frame, but simply because neither one of us could physically bear the agonizing thought of letting it end. Harrison's powerful hands glided over my skin with a beautifully practiced rhythm now, dragging slowly and heavily down the entire length of my arms before aggressively sweeping across the wide expanse of my upper back. Every single agonizingly calm and certain stroke of his hands acted exactly like a massive iron anchor dropping deep into warm tropical waters, intensely grounding my frantic, terrified soul. He possessed an uncanny, intuitive knowledge of exactly where to pause his motions, exactly where to dig in and apply brutal, completely necessary pressure, and exactly where to just simply remain perfectly, agonizingly still. A massive expanse of time passed without a single spoken word between us. Yet I could acutely feel the crushing gravity of absolutely everything we were leaving, unsaid, communicating directly through his touch, especially as his long fingers meticulously traced the hollow space between my shoulder blades, where literal years of bitter tension had stubbornly settled into my bones, like thick, gray dust. Gradually, with every single agonizing pass of his warm hands, I genuinely felt myself actively letting go of the brutal years I had wasted desperately trying to hold my fractured family together, releasing the suffocating loneliness that I had stubbornly refused to ever speak aloud, and finally mourning the vibrant, passionate woman I had long ago stopped recognizing whenever I looked in the mirror. I let out a deep, shuddering exhale that racked my entire frame, a sound born not from physical pain, but from sheer, overwhelming emotional relief. Keeping my heavy eyes closed tightly shut, I desperately whispered into the darkness that he was absolutely incredible at doing this. He deliberately let the compliment hang in the thick air before his low, rough voice drifted from just behind my ear, softly confessing that he just desperately wanted me to finally feel genuinely cared for in the exact same incredible way I had always made him feel his entire life. A sudden profound ache aggressively bloomed right in the absolute center of my chest. A slow, beautifully quiet kind of pain that absolutely doesn't actually hurt, but simply makes you hyper, aware of every single beating fragile thing living inside of you. I shifted my body slightly on the table, turning just enough to fully see him standing there directly behind me, his massive hands now resting limply at his sides as his broad chest rose and fell with incredibly slow, even breaths. My voice was barely a trembling whisper, barely audible over the low thrum of the studio music, as I forced out a choked, desperate, "Thank you." He finally reached out for me, doing so without any jarring abruptness or desperate urgency. He just slowly and methodically wrapped his incredibly strong arms entirely around my trembling frame in a deeply protective way that felt agonizingly, wonderfully complete. I completely surrendered to gravity, letting my heavy head fall back to rest, flush against his solid chest, completely allowing the intoxicating blended scent of clean cotton fabric and sharp lavender oil to completely fill the shrinking air between our bodies. His muscular arms tightened their iron grip just slightly, almost as if he were silently terrified that I might suddenly regain my senses and violently pull away from him. But I absolutely didn't budge an inch. The terrifying truth was that I physically couldn't. I absolutely hadn't been physically held like this in actual years. Not touched like a wildly desirable woman, and certainly not embraced like a human being who genuinely mattered to someone. We remained perfectly frozen in that exact position for what felt like an eternity, absolutely refusing to move, aggressively refusing to talk, simply synchronizing our heavy breathing together inside the quiet, insulated sanctuary we had magically built, a space that felt incredibly tender, violently fragile, and undeniably sacred. When I eventually gathered the absolute courage to tilt my head up, our eyes instantly locked together, and absolutely everything I had been desperately trying so hard not to name was suddenly right there, burning brightly in the dangerous space between us. I felt absolutely zero toxic shame, and absolutely no panicked confusion. I only felt the blinding, inescapable truth. "I see you, Mom," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. But in that specific, highly charged moment, the very word Mom felt suffocatingly, impossibly small compared to the raw emotion vibrating in his deep voice, and entirely too narrow to encompass the burning, intense fire shining inside his dark eyes. And God help me, I made absolutely no move whatsoever to stop him when he began to lean his face down toward mine with agonizing, tortuous slowness, acting exactly as if he intentionally wanted to give me plenty of time to panic and change my mind. His warm lips lightly brushed a fleeting, burning kiss right against the skin of my forehead, and then slowly trailed down to press gently against my flushed cheek. He froze right there, his warm lips hovering a fraction of an inch away, patiently waiting, absolutely not pushing boundaries, not aggressively asking, but just beautifully, terrifyingly offering. And when our lips finally collided in a soft, impossibly gentle kiss, it completely bypassed cheap, fleeting physical desire and struck something infinitely deeper. It was absolutely everything else. That single, earth-shattering kiss was entirely composed of years of quiet, fierce loyalty, years of relentlessly showing up for one another in the absolute darkest of times, and years of a profound love that had imperceptibly shifted, violently grown, and beautifully deepened into an intoxicating reality that absolutely neither of us had ever planned for, but that both of us instantly, undeniably recognized. We eventually pulled slowly back, but only just enough to allow our foreheads to remain resting entirely together. The intoxicating heat of his breath washed heavily over my sensitized skin as he whispered fiercely, "I am here." And in that exact, crystallizing second, I inherently believed his promise far more deeply than I had believed anything from anyone in an incredibly long, painful time. Following that massive, earth-shattering moment, we didn't speak another word to each other for a very long while. Not because we were paralyzed by fear, and certainly not out of some suffocating societal guilt, but simply because we were basking deeply in the good, heavy kind of silence. It was the exceedingly rare kind of silence that firmly wraps around two absolutely shattered people, exactly like a thick, soft security blanket, making it feel exactly as though the entire room itself is deliberately holding its breath, just to completely ensure that absolutely nothing perfectly delicate gets carelessly broken. He remained firmly planted right there, standing absolutely solid with me in that beautifully suspended quiet for a very, very long time. Then, moving with incredible, terrifying reverence, his large hand slowly drifted down and eventually found mine. Our trembling fingers naturally intertwined in a gentle, exploring clasp that was completely devoid of toxic possessiveness or panicked rushing. It was just pure, electric, undeniably profound connection. When I finally had to forcibly pull myself away, just to mechanically fold a stray towel on the table, I instantly noticed that my hands were surprisingly rock steady, yet something incredibly fundamental inside my very soul had irrevocably mutated and changed. The massive change absolutely wasn't solely because of the taboo kiss itself, but entirely because of the massive, beautiful weight of absolutely everything that the kiss carried inherently with it. Later that same evening, we smoothly and flawlessly navigated our way through the house, in the exact same comforting, familiar manner we absolutely always had. He dutifully helped me wash the dinner dishes in the sink. I methodically sorted out the dirty laundry in the hall, and we laughed loudly together over a classic, grainy old movie playing on the television. Yet, despite the entirely mundane activities, there was an undeniably new, sparkling energy crackling aggressively in the air between us, bringing with it a beautiful ease and a profoundly soft, unspoken understanding. We collectively realized that absolutely not everything in this complicated world needs to be strictly labeled or aggressively named. Some incredibly profound things could just simply be fiercely, undeniably felt. The very next morning, the sun was just barely beginning to peek over the horizon when I stumbled out of my room and found him in the kitchen once again. He was completely barefoot, looking incredibly endearing and only half awake as he stood there brewing a fresh pot of hot coffee. His thick hair was an absolute chaotic mess, and the pale golden morning light, filtering in directly through the kitchen window, painted him flawlessly with the ethereal look of someone who was caught squarely in the hazy borderlands between a lingering dream and the harsh reality of the waking day. When he turned his head, looked deeply at me, and flashed a devastatingly warm smile, a massive epiphany hit me like a runaway freight train. I suddenly realized right then and there that I absolutely wasn't actually terrified of what our relationship had magically morphed into. Rather, I was utterly, completely terrified by the dark realization that I had almost lived my entire miserable life without ever once experiencing what it actually felt like to be this beautifully, entirely fully known by another human being. "Good morning," he offered casually, his deep voice thick and soft with lingering sleep. I boldly stepped right up incredibly close beside his towering frame. "Good morning," I whispered intimately back, as he reached out to hand me the warm ceramic mug. Our bare hands brushed against each other yet again. but this time there was absolutely no shocking jolt of panic spark and entirely zero anxious tension. There was just a beautiful, consuming, perfect warmth. Throughout that entire weekend, we made a silent, mutual pact to absolutely not verbally discuss exactly what had transpired in the dim light of the studio. We didn't frantically try to slap a socially acceptable label onto our new, shifting reality, but whenever he happened to walk closely past me in the narrow hallway and placed a quiet, heavy hand firmly against the small of my back, I found myself instinctively leaning deeply back into his solid strength, without a single second thought. I finally learned the hard way that not absolutely everything in human existence has to be excruciatingly complicated. I realized that sometimes the most profound love absolutely isn't obnoxiously loud, and it certainly isn't always wild, chaotic, or dangerously sudden. Sometimes the realest love is meticulously built up at a slow, agonizing pace, completely hidden deep within mundane, everyday gestures, actively thriving in perfectly shared silences, and entirely proven by the simple way someone consciously chooses to firmly stay when things get incredibly dark. The exact way he stayed, and the completely surrendered way I finally allowed him to. One quiet evening, I deliberately stepped foot into the empty studio entirely alone, immediately noticing that the sharp, clean scent of the lavender oil still hung thickly in the completely still air. The ambient music was playing at a low, hypnotic hum, and the room felt perfectly still and immensely protected. I walked slowly over, sat down heavily on the edge of the massage table, securely rested my calloused palms flat against my thighs, and slowly fluttered my tired eyes tightly closed. My mind immediately drifted backward, deeply thinking about all the literal years I had sacrificed, meticulously touching broken people with genuine care, desperately trying to help them feel somewhat human again. It hit me then with a beautiful poetic justice, that in the very end, it absolutely wasn't a wealthy paying client or some handsome random stranger who had finally managed to forcefully bring that incredible gift of profound healing right back to me. It was profoundly and undeniably brought back by someone who had intimately known me all along. It was beautifully returned by the exact person who had spent his entire life watching me endlessly give and give of myself, and who had quietly, fiercely chosen to finally give absolutely all of that back to me. When Harrison silently entered the dim room just a few minutes later, he completely bypassed the need for useless words. He simply stepped directly behind me, gently placed his massive, warm hands upon my completely relaxed shoulders, and securely rested his heavy forehead right against the back of my head. We remained perfectly locked in that exact pose for an absolute eternity, existing simultaneously as a mother and a son, as a living woman and a grown man, and ultimately just as two heavily battered people who had successfully weathered life's most brutal storms and had somehow miraculously found ultimate comfort completely within each other. I knew entirely without a doubt that absolutely no one in the outside world would ever be able to remotely comprehend or understand it. But the absolute beautiful truth was that they absolutely didn't ever need to, because right there, completely hidden away inside that quiet, deeply sacred space we had flawlessly built together, we fully understood it. And for the absolute rest of my life, that brutal, beautiful understanding was going to be entirely more than enough.